Welcome to Lecture 13. Lecture 13 is all about drawing conclusions. Lecture 13 corresponds to Chapter 13 of your textbook, or the first module of, or the first section of Module 4. Let's assume that you've completed a research project, you have all the data, you've done the analysis, you've presented the data in the form of graphs and tables, or in the forms of a quoted descriptive report if it was a qualitative study. At the end of the study, it's important to draw conclusions, both for yourself as a researcher to ask yourself where your project led you, or alternatively, you have to communicate what the conclusions are to a readership or an audience that will make conclusions about what they may have understood or learned from your research. So these key questions are presented in your textbook as well. The questions you want to ask is, what did you ask? What was the research question or the research objective? Or what was the hypothesis? So that section, you should always talk about that in the context of literature that was around when we are presenting a conclusion. What we also need to talk about in our conclusion is, what did we find? Maybe what we asked was exactly answered. Perhaps it was not. Perhaps we found something completely different. And so what do we conclude? Does this make sense? Do the results, do the findings make sense in the context of the question asked? Or do they not? And if they do not, why do we think they don't? If there's anything confounding, if there are confounding variables and so on. And then finally, the thing to be addressed in a conclusion is, to whom do these results apply? In a quantitative study, if it's a random sample, then we talk about the applicability to a larger population. But as we have learned, that sampling may not be random, and it might involve a certain subset. Perhaps it's a sudden sample, perhaps it's a snowball sample, perhaps it's a quota sample that we've had to use to answer our question. So we have to be careful about who we apply the conclusions and findings to. So the key questions, what did you ask? What did you find? What do you conclude? And to whom do these results apply? These are the questions that you should attempt to answer in the conclusion. Usually a conclusion depends. If it is a thesis, then a conclusion chapter, it's an entire chapter. It may be a few pages. In a research article or a paper, it's 1 to 2 paragraphs. And in something smaller like a report, a conclusion is very brief, perhaps as little as, I want to say, a few sentences. So that's how you conclude whatever it is that you need to. Remember, your conclusions, not only do they have to relate your findings to research questions, what they must also do is to embed your findings into the broader literature. Right? So this lecture and the next one are essentially very short because we have discussed all of these areas before, and then the textbook presents a pretty detailed idea on what you want to do with your conclusions. It's again, it's not an extensive chapter. It's an important chapter. You have to have a conclusion. So again, take your time to read and answer the questions in the back. Then come back to the study guide, do the exercises, view the videos. If you have any questions, email the professor, and that's pretty much it. So you get off easy today. All right. Thanks. and we will see you in lecture 14, which also promises to be very